Jesus said that John the Baptist was Elijah. John said he wasn't. Who was right? Hi, I'm David Servant. This is HeavenWord TV. Well, glory to God, it is great to be together once again. And we're working our way, as you know, through the entire New Testament chronologically. Study brings us today to Matthew chapter 17. And just to fit a little context here, Jesus, along with Peter, James, and John, were up on a certain mountain, which we don't know. Jesus was transfigured before them, according to what he had told them just 6 days earlier, that some would not taste death until they saw the Son of Man coming in his glory and his kingdom. And he was transfigured. He was shining like lightning, and they were completely blown away. Peter spoke up and said, "It's good for us to be here, Lord." And we can see Jesus, and they also saw Moses and Elijah. They were discussing Jesus' departure, which he would soon accomplish in Jerusalem. Okay, so all that we've been over, and we're going to begin in verse number 9 of Matthew chapter 17 today. Read along with me, if you will. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, saying, "Tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man has risen from the dead." And we talked about how Peter did that, and he talked about it in his second epistle decades later. And his disciples asked him, and this is where we left off last time, verse number 10, "Why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" Because he had just said, "Don't tell anyone about this vision till after I've risen from the dead." And they know that they have just seen him as they will see him coming in his kingdom. That's what he had promised them about a week ago. And so they're thinking about what it's going to be like, when the Son of Man comes back. And they're trying to put the pieces together, realize they didn't even know as much as probably you and I know, who have studied this, in some cases for years and years. So they ask the question, why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first, come before the coming of the Messiah? Now, why are they asking that question? Well, they just saw Elijah up on the mountaintop there, How they knew it was Elijah, how they knew it was Moses, I don't know, but they knew they had just seen Elijah. They knew he was alive and well. Nobody had seen him for some 800 years prior to that, okay? And he's alive and well, and he's interested in what's going on in the life of Jesus and what he's about to do. And so, let's talk about why the scribes did say that Elijah must come first. They got it from the Bible. They got it from the book of Malachi, from the last chapter, as a matter of fact. It's referred to there. Elijah's referred to actually twice near the end of the book of Malachi. Malachi has 4 chapters. At the beginning of chapter 3, here's a familiar verse. Take a look at this one with me. Malachi 3, verse number 1. "Behold, I am going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts." And so people were looking for the messenger of the covenant who would go before him. And then if we just skip a few verses, we come to Malachi chapter 4, and right near the end, speaking of Malachi in verse number 5, "Behold, I'm going to send you Elijah, the prophet, preceding the great and terrible day of the Lord." Okay, so that's why they were looking for Elijah to come before the great and terrible day of the Lord, because God promised it in the final sentence of what he said in the Old Testament. And then he didn't say anything for, I think, 400 years, the silent centuries there. So then we read the last verse here of Malachi, verse number 6. "He will restore the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, so that I will not come and smite the land with a curse." So he would have a restorative ministry, this Elijah who would come before the great and terrible day of the Lord. So that's why the scribes taught that. And perhaps they were stumbling over that whole thing regarding Jesus, saying, well, this can't be the Messiah, this can't be the anointed one, because we were told that Elijah must come first. You might recall that there was a time when John the Baptist was preaching out in the wilderness, and some scribes and Pharisees came to him, and they said, "Who are you?" And the first thing they asked him was, "Are you the Christ?" He said, "No, I am not." The second question they asked him was, "Are you Elijah?" That's actually found in John chapter 1, verse number 21. Might I read this with you real quickly? They asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" And he said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" He answered, "No." So that's very interesting. But I first want to focus on the fact that they wanted to know, are you Elijah? Why were they asking if he was Elijah? Because Malachi, God through Malachi had promised Elijah would be coming before the great and terrible day of the Lord. So who are you? Now, what's also interesting is that Jesus said that John the Baptist did fulfill in part what Malachi said would happen, that he would send a messenger, that was Malachi chapter 3, and that he would send Elijah. In part, Jesus said that John the Baptist fulfilled those prophecies. And yet John said, "I'm not Elijah." So what does that tell you? Who is right? Who is wrong? Well, Jesus is always right. Right. So John the Baptist was wrong. Well, how could John the Baptist be wrong? Well, he didn't know. He did not know that he was fulfilling certain prophecies. He knew that he was the voice crying in the wilderness, that we read about, also a prophecy from Isaiah, but he didn't know that he was fulfilling Malachi's prophecies. Okay. All right, now this gets even more interesting. So let's jump back then to Matthew chapter 17 and see Jesus' response to the disciples when they asked, "Why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" This is verse number 11 of Matthew 17. He answered and said, "Elijah is coming." So he is affirming the fact that before the great and terrible day of the Lord, as Malachi had said, Elijah would come. And he said, Elijah's coming and will restore all things. Remember I said, we saw it from Malachi, that one of the things he do is he restore the hearts of the fathers to the children and vice versa. So there's that direct reference to what Malachi said about the ministry of Elijah. But, verse 12, "I say to you that Elijah already came." Ooh, that's interesting. That's John the Baptist. Be right back. Okay, welcome back. We are in Matthew chapter 17. We're talking about John the Baptist. We're also talking about Elijah because Jesus said that in one sense, John the Baptist was Elijah. Now, that shouldn't be a surprise to us at this point in time. Why? Well, because 30-some years prior to this, before John the Baptist was even born, Gabriel was appearing to John's father, Zacharias. Remember that story? Okay, it's in the first chapter of Luke's Gospel. Let's read Luke chapter 1, verses 16, 17, just to kind of get this in context. Gabriel said to John's father, "He will turn many of the sons of Israel back to the Lord their God." Verse 17, "And it is he who will go as a forerunner before him in the spirit and power of Elijah." See, so already, before the man's even born, he's already being identified with Elijah. And what for? To turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children. That's reading from Luke chapter 1, verse number 17. That's a direct quote from Malachi, which we read the last time, okay? "And the disobedient to the attitude of the righteous, so as to make ready a people prepared for the Lord," okay? So that's number one evidence. Now, number two evidence is that way back in Matthew chapter 11, when Jesus was giving his tribute to John the Baptist, you might recall, we talked about this when we read it. He was saying, among those born of women, there's no one greater than John the Baptist. And he went on to say, if you care to accept it, now I'm going to read to you from Matthew chapter 11, verse number 14. "If you are willing to accept it, John himself is Elijah who was to come." So based upon that verse alone, we could wrongly assume, however, that John completely fulfilled Malachi chapter 4 and verse number 5, where God said, I'm going to send Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. But, however, we have this very interesting verse where we're reading now in Matthew chapter 17 when Peter, James, and John asked Jesus about Elijah. How come the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And we've already read this. Let's read it again so we get all the context. Verse number 11 of Matthew chapter 17. He answered and said, Elijah is coming and will restore all things. So there's no doubt a future fulfillment of Malachi chapter 4 and verses 5 and 6. But I say to you, this is verse number 12, that Elijah already came and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they wished. So also the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. So this is like the second time he's made reference to his soon coming sufferings. Now, verse number 13, then the disciples understood that he had spoken to them about John the Baptist. Okay, so I think we've really done a thorough look at John the Baptist's connection, identification with Elijah. Was John the Baptist actually Elijah? No, no, no. He would come in the spirit and in the power of Elijah. Okay, that's what Gabriel had said to John's father, Zacharias. And Malachi said that, God said through Malachi, I will send you Elijah. And Jesus confirms that Elijah is coming. Here's the question. Will it actually be Elijah, the person Elijah? Or will it be someone like John the Baptist who came in the spirit and power of Elijah? Well, that's a great question. I'm not claiming I know the answer to it. What fascinates me in this is that in verse number 11 of Matthew 17, Jesus said, Elijah is coming and will restore all things. And that's something we already read in Malachi chapter 4 and verse number 6, the final verse of the Old Testament. He will restore the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to their fathers. There's that restorative ministry of the future coming John the Baptist. Some say, they surmise, they assume that one of the two witnesses that we read about in the book of Revelation who prophesy, and then they're ultimately killed in the streets of Jerusalem, that one of those two witnesses is Elijah. A couple reasons. They'll say, well, Jesus did say he is coming. And but on the other hand, when I read about those two witnesses in the book of Revelation, I can't say that I see, that there's any restorative ministry described through those two prophets who prophesy. I mean, they just torment the world with their prophecies. Basically, nobody repents, and then they're killed. And then a few days later, they're resurrected, and then they fly up to heaven, So I'm not one of those ones who thinks that what Jesus said, Elijah is coming, will be fulfilled during the ministry of those two witnesses. I'm more inclined to think that there will be, I'm hoping, I'm understanding this right, there'll be somebody with a ministry like John the Baptist who will be anointed with that powerful preaching ability and spirit and anointing and will attract many people, and there'll be a restoration of all things, And that, boy, I wish I knew more about exactly what Christ said there. We know he said that he'll restore the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to their fathers. I've always wondered if that is talking about, earthly parents and their earthly children with their earthly fathers because there's a lot of rebellious children. Or I wondered if it has some other deeper spiritual meaning, like he's going to restore the hearts of people who are spiritual children to the hearts of the spiritual fathers, in one sense, that we'd go back to the Bible and there'd be a restoration of Christianity in its primitive form when it was pure and unadulterated with all the traditions and trappings that we find today in the church. I don't believe there's going to be a complete reformation of the entire world of Christendom, but I would certainly hope that there'd be a restoration of the book of Acts, at least within a segment or a group within Christendom that would turn their hearts back to God. That would be absolutely wonderful. Okay? All right. More to come, more interesting stuff to come. can't wait to get to it. Be right back. Christians who escaped from North Korea are temporarily staying. So we've been blessed to deliver some rice to them today to help sustain them. Now we know. Okay, let's get back into Matthew chapter 17. We finished Jesus' information there about John the Baptist and his connection to Elijah. And now he and Peter and James and John are coming down the mountain. Peter and James and John, can you imagine them? They've just had the experience of their lives. They just saw Moses and Elijah. These guys have been dead for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and they just saw them, and they're not allowed to tell anybody about it. I feel so sorry for those guys. Although on the other hand, I feel jealous of those guys. They were so blessed, but they have to zip their lips tight and not give a word. And if one of the other disciples asks them, well, what happened up on the mountain? They have to say something amazing, but I can't tell you. Not until Jesus is risen from the dead, whatever that means. All right, so here we are. They come down the mountain. We're in Matthew chapter 17 and verse number 14. Let's read a couple verses. When they came to the crowd, a man came up to Jesus, falling on his knees before him and saying, quote, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is a lunatic and is very ill. For he often falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not cure him. Okay, so this is a desperate man, a desperate situation. Our heart goes out to him, and we have many questions. Why? I'm not sure this story answers every question, but I'm glad it has a happy ending. I'm sure you've probably read it before. Now, we could keep going in Matthew, but Matthew devotes maybe about 8 or 9 verses to it, whereas Mark's gospel, which is generally shorter, overall in every respect to Matthew's gospel, in this case, he's got a lot more information than Matthew does, as well as Luke does on this particular story. So come on over with me to Mark chapter 9, and let's take this bit by bit. And we won't get through it all this time, but we're going to take our time and see what we can learn, okay? Mark chapter 9, verse number 14, read along with me. When they came back to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and some scribes arguing with them. Scribes arguing with the 9 who had been left behind. Verse number 15, immediately when the entire crowd saw him, they were amazed and began running up to greet him. And he asked them, what are you discussing with them? That is, the scribes. What are you talking about with those guys? In verse number 17, one of the crowd answered him, Teacher, I brought you my son, possessed with a spirit which makes him mute, not able to speak. And of course, Matthew didn't tell us that. Matthew just said his father said he's a lunatic and he's very ill. He falls into the fire and he falls often into the water. Now, back to Mark chapter 9 and verse number 18. Whenever it seizes him, it slams him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and stiffens out. I told your disciples to cast it out, and they could not do it. I mean, this is really a heartbreaking story, isn't it? And people say, well, this was epilepsy. Well, it had the characteristics of epilepsy, but it seems much, much greater than that, right? I mean, the kid sometimes is walking by a fire and suddenly he begins convulsing right at that strange time and he falls into the fire. So this kid may have burns on him. Sometimes they're walking by water, the Sea of Galilee or something, and all of a sudden he has convulsions and he falls off into the water and his dad's diving in there to say, so this thing's trying to kill him. And he's slammed to the ground. And of course, grinding his teeth and stiffening out, that could be epilepsy if it was by itself, and foaming at the mouth. It just is just heartbreaking. Let's just take a moment and look at what Luke says, okay? In his description of it, I'm reading now from Luke verse 38 of chapter 9. In this case, Luke tells us that the man says, I beg you, look at my son, for he is my only boy. And it makes it even more, desperate on his part, wow. And verse number 39, and a spirit seizes him and he suddenly screams. But we didn't get that from anyone yet. So, there's screaming going on here. And it throws him into a convulsion with foaming at the mouth, and only with difficulty does it leave him, mauling him as it leaves. So, this is heartbreaking. Any parent who would endure this would just be heartbroken and distressed and looking for answers. And of course, when this man heard about Jesus, who was healing all kinds of people of every kind of thing and casting out demons, he said, there's my solution. I got to get my son to Jesus. Well, he finds the general location where Jesus is at, but Jesus is nowhere to be found. There's 9 of his disciples, and they said, he's up at the mountain. He told us, stay here. Don't come up. And so he'll be back sooner or later. He comes back, but in the meantime, those 9 whom Jesus had already given authority to cast out demons and who had successfully cast out demons, you may recall, in the gospel accounts, when Jesus sent them out, they came back rejoicing, saying, even the demons are subject to us in your name. And he said, don't be so surprised. I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning. So they had already successfully cast out demons by the authority that Jesus had given them. But in this case, with this young boy who had this terrible possession, the terrible demonization of this spirit that's trying to kill him, it looks like, they tried and they failed. Again, we read in verse number 18 of chapter 9, I told your disciples to cast it out, and they could not do it. All right, so that is the first question that this little story begins to raise. These 9 guys gave it their best shot. They did what they had always done before, and this time, nothing worked. It didn't work like it had worked before. And Jesus reacts immediately upon hearing the news of their failure. And it's not like a good reaction in the sense of, he's not happy about it. He's very upset about it. Verse number 19 of Mark 9. He answered them and said, O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me. Okay, well, we're unfortunately out of time, but we're going to go deep, deep, deep into this next time and find out exactly why they failed and how that applies to us. Can't wait. See you next time.